I thought it was appropriate for an education channel, which mostly this will be, to start with the concept of research. Whether it's an individual who wants to learn on their own, or it's a student at one of the college instructions or classes that I end up working with, this is a question that I get quite a bit. And I think it's important that perhaps we start at the ground level. Research, when we're discussing the topic, whether it is in a classical science or in the topics of education themselves, sometimes what people do is they create a hypothesis and then they go out and they look for information to prove what they believe to be true. That's not research. That's actually confirmation bias, and I'll talk about that a little bit later. Instead, I want to focus on the topics and the terminology that is more common into professional research. We all bring something into the research, whether it's an explicit bias or an implicit bias. Explicit being something that we acknowledge, we know, we have this, we're going to work against it. Implicit is buried inside of the study. We may or may not know about it, but we're not acknowledging it. And here in this diagram, it's these sad little blades of grass that are saying, this is kind of the baggage that I've brought in. Unfortunately, when many students start the process of research, they end up hitting this wall. In this case, there's a drawing of this somewhat deformed, sad little beaver who's stuck. Where do I even get started? And one of the problems with research is there's a lot of stuff that's buried underneath. These are the things that we know. And because we know them, and being human beings, we have a tendency to think that if we know them, everybody must know them, and have the same perspective as me. Sometimes research can become a more daunting task. There's also these branches up here, so I'd say that it's less a wall and more of a tree, and you'll hear these terms put out of ontology and epistemology. Ontology is what we know. It's a philosophy. There's typically two large branches between them, and we'll discuss those just a little bit later, and then there's some little topics in between them. But ontology is, what do I know? And epistemology is, why do I know? What justifies what I know? There's upper branches, and that is your methodologies. Methodologies being the framework and processes that we're going to look at to justify what we know. And unfortunately, many students actually start their research up here, which, if you're starting up here and you're not aware of what's going on inside of research and the full scope of what can happen, it's quite possible to become confused. And you kind of end up, I had a professor that said, in the weeds, I think it's more related to falling completely off the tree. You'll end up starting the paper, having to go back, redo it, you can't justify what you want, and you're not sure how to say what you want to say. I understand that. Many people have that. I had to recreate this video about 20 times before I was happy with it. And probably in a year, I'll sit back and go, I've got to go back and redo that. Above methodology is your methods. Methods is going to be the actual processes, which you look at the framework which then looks at the justification for what you know. This is a philosophical question down here. There's no one correct answer. There's also tools. And these are the main points when you're looking at research. I have about 18 years of education that I went through college for my degrees, and what I found was that, at least in my experience, I went backwards down the tree. I would not recommend that, and one of the reasons I've created this channel is to try to help people understand that you really don't want to be starting up here and moving backwards. I would have personally benefited and maybe not spent quite so long had I understood that there's these issues down here that have to be resolved, acknowledged, and then start looking up in here. When you hear a term like constructivism, or a person will say, I believe in constructivism, or constructed knowledge, or holistic knowledge, that's actually up here. Epistemology, they're constructing their knowledge for what they believe. And so sometimes it gets placed in the wrong area, and a student will come to me and they'll say, well, I believe in constructivism for ontology. And I'm like, wait a minute. You believe in constructing knowledge. That's, broadly speaking, constructivism. I'll talk about those styles later in another video. That's really epistemology. You're constructing knowledge to justify what you know. When we look at methodology, which sits above that, that's your framework for developing processes for your justifications. You're looking at two major qualifications, two major branches, and there's a third branch in between, which is mixed methods, which is quantitative and qualitative. Quantitative, you're looking at generally statistical information, quantities, which is where it gets its name from. And so it's going to be numerical in some fashion. Qualitative, you're looking at research that is being conducted that does not necessarily lend itself into numerical groupings. It is important to understand there's some crossover between them. It's not fair to say qualitative research will never have numbers, because you're certainly going to code many times qualitative research, and it's going to have some sort of numerical values that you can assign. And quantitative may also be looking at information that is, yes, it's going to be numerical in quantities, but you can actually look deeper into that by adjusting variables, which you will do in something like experimental or quasi-experimental research. An example of qualitative is phenomenology, phenomenon or themes that you're looking for within a social group, and ethnography, which is either cultural or perhaps you're looking at a particular job. Hotel clerk across a region, and you want to see if they have shared experiences. When you get over into the quantitative, you're looking at something like correlation. This is what I actually did my dissertation on, looking for points that might match. Now, be aware that when we're looking at points that match, that doesn't mean that if A and B both spike that they may be related, they may not be related. It just means there's something underneath them that is making those two spike. Or quasi-experimental, which is where you're manipulating a variable. in order to see what happens to another variable. And with all of these, my plan is to have further short videos that will kind of explain what's going on here out in the leaves of this tree. Mixed methods is in between them. It brings in both qualitative and quantitative in an effort to bring them together. There are some drawbacks to mixed methods, and one of the biggest drawbacks is simply in time and complexity. When I went through university, I had professors that would argue over whether qualitative or quantitative or mixed methods, which one is better. And sometimes I think that confuses the students. In reality, where you end up in this branch depends upon your research question. Certain research questions lend themselves to being quantitative or lend themselves to be qualitative. One of the mistakes that I made early on when I started my research is I decided that I wanted to do qualitative first, and then I was trying to figure out how I'm going to get my framework to fit into qualitative, and I really couldn't do it and have any sort of competent research. So first you have to develop your research question and then kind of get up here into the top of the tree. And that's why I like to introduce students into down here on the research and understand what is their beliefs, why do they believe what they believe, how is that going to influence their framework, what is their research question, and is it neutral, and then which branch we're actually going to end up in. When you look at surveys can be a method or it can be a tool. It depends how it's being used. If you're looking at the term survey as I'm going to be asking people to get information, that is typically more of a questionnaire. And so it's become kind of autumn up here on the tree. You have experiments and there's observations. These are tools and methods, and you have to, a tool can be an observation. I'm going to observe a group, be distant from it, perhaps a classroom, and I'm going to take note of how people respond in a certain way. That really is not measurable, or rather it's measurable based on your own perceptions, and so you're probably over here in the qualitative branch. But I might be doing an experiment, whether it's a social experiment or I'm going to be doing a traditional chemistry experiment. Checklists are another form of tools up here. When you get into epistemology, you're looking at something like Alethiology, which is a nice, impressive word. It just means what is truth. And I have two links below, one to a paper that discusses Alethiology so that any of the students that come to May for Help can go down to, and any of you may benefit from. And there's also an interesting link to a video by Joe Scott. I believe it's Answers with Joe, and he will talk about what is truth and is it subjective or objective. And there's also multi-epistemological approaches, that you're going to blend some of the different epistemologies together, and you're going to use this framework there to justify what you believe supports the rest of your research. Sometimes when I am working with a student or I'm doing peer review of colleagues, I find that they're a little top-heavy, that they haven't really given much of a foundation for what is going on at the bottom of the research. Ontology is where your assumptions come from. And every time you're going to conduct a research study, whether formal or informal, you're making assumptions. We have to, because there's too much knowledge out there. And so we'll say, well, we know that this happens. That is within your ontological processes. That's your ontology. These are the assumptions that I'm making about this research. My epistemology is, how do I know those assumptions are true? How did I come to those assumptions? And so this is not part of the research process that should be neglected, although sometimes it kind of is. When we get down to ontology, we're looking at realism and anti-realism. It doesn't mean in realism and anti-realism that something is real and isn't real. It's a little more of, if you're in realism, is it objective? Realism posits that there is a set of known facts, and we all believe those known facts. And traditional Western science was based on realism. That paradigm has changed, and I'll talk about paradigms next week. But that paradigm has changed slightly over towards anti-realism. Anti-realism is that there is a subjective construction of knowledge. What we do is we construct reality around us, and it's based more on our perceptions than on actual objective evidence. The reason for this is in quantum physics. Quantum physics changed the understanding of realism, and it's given us, I think currently we're doing something called reductionism. We're going to break things down to the smallest part, and so we may be moving towards this anti-realism and the different ontologies over on this side. Now, sometimes I think students can get lost. There's a lot here, so let me remove the parts that we don't really need to worry too much about right now. I'm going to remove this. I'm going to remove some of these tools to get started. I'm going to remove some of the methods. I'm going to remove the examples. I missed checklist. I have a checklist in Photoshop here, and I missed the checklist. That's always good. I'm also going to remove the sad drawing of the beaver and the grass and the ground level and the roots. Because in reality, this is your map. And remember, mixed methods is in the way, right? It's maybe blocking the road there. There are students that they are determined they're going to do a mixed method study. I'm still in contact with one. He's been doing his doctorate program for quite some time, because mixed methods can be complicated, and partly it can be complicated. It's kind of how complicated you make it, but partly it's complicated because you have to have both of these questions answered completely within. There has to be a reason for that you're doing quantitative or qualitative. I like math. That doesn't mean that every research project I do should end up in quantitative. Or somebody may detest math and they don't want to deal with numbers at all. They might end up doing some qualitative work. So this is the map that I end up drawing a little differently sometimes for students when they come by and they need some help, or for people that I meet and they ask questions about research. This video will be followed up later in the week with a question and answer session. I may not have any questions in the comments below, which is fine. I have more than enough questions that get asked sometimes and have been asked over the years that I will address them. I'm not going to do it in this format. When I'm in a classroom, it's easier for me to answer a question specifically to that person or meet with them after class and answer more completely. But in the YouTube format, that may not work. So instead, I'm going to play some vaguely educational games, and if nothing else, what you will learn is that I am not really very good at these games. If you have any questions, please put them below, and I hope that you've been able to gain something out of this. Take care.